accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting.
Il en est ainsi décidé.
It is so decided.
Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite M. Adedeji Ebo, haut représentant adjoint pour les affaires de désarmement, à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé.
It is so decided.
Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant
The Security
aborder
Council will now
l'examen du
begin
point
its
2 de
consideration
l'ordre du
of
jour.
item 2 of the agenda.
Je donne à présent la
I now
parole
give
à
the floor
M.
to Mr.
Adedeji Ebo.
Ebo.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, since the last briefing by the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs to the Security Council on the topic of transfers of military assets to Ukraine in February this year, the provision of military assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine has continued. Information from governments about their transfers of weapon systems and ammunition is available in open sources. These transfers have included heavy conventional weapons, including battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions and small arms and light weapons. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons, such as uncrewed combat aerial vehicles and ammunition, to the Russian armed forces for use in Ukraine. Moreover, media outlets have reported on the transfer of major conventional arms, including artillery rocket systems, to non-state groups involved in the war in Ukraine. The large-scale influx of weapons and ammunition into any situation of armed conflict raises concerns for peace, security, and stability, including as a result of diversion. Measures to address the risk of diversion to unauthorized end users and for unauthorized uses are essential to prevent further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, in the region, and beyond. Such measures include pre-transfer risk assessment, end-user certification, effective legal and enforcement measures, and post-shipment verifications, such as on-site inspections. Diversion prevention also requires cooperation and information exchange between importing, transit, and exporting states, as well as concrete measures such as marking and tracing, effective accounting practices, and physical safeguarding of arms and ammunition, as well as customs and border control measures. The United Nations Register of Conventional Arms, UNROCA, remains a key tool in this regard. Transparency in armaments can serve as a confidence-building measure, thereby contributing to the prevention and reduction of misperceptions and tensions among member states. In its 30 years of operation, 178 member states have submitted a report to UNROCA at least once. I call upon member states to participate in this mechanism. Shut it off. I call upon member states to participate in this mechanism, including because it helps to track the influx of weapons in conflict zones. To prevent the diversion of conventional arms and regulate the international arms trade, states have also established a number of arms control treaties and instruments. This includes the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, and its International Tracing Instrument. Moreover, member states are in the process of elaborating a new global framework for through-life conventional ammunition management. I call on states to consider joining relevant treaties and to implement their legal obligations and political commitments under conventional arms control instruments to which they are party, in order to minimize the risk of diversion of arms and ammunition. Madam President, beyond addressing arms transfers, all parties to the conflict, have a duty to protect civilians in armed conflict and to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including and especially international humanitarian law. Since 24 February 2022, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 23,821 civilian casualties in Ukraine, 8,836 killed, and 14,985 injured, with the actual figures likely to be considerably higher. Most of the civilian deaths and injuries continue to be caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, including attacks by heavy artillery, tanks, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and airstrikes. After almost 15 months of the Russian Federation's military offensive into Ukraine, suffering, loss, displacement, and destruction continue to form part of an unbearable routine. In addition to the thousands of civilians killed and injured, the destruction of essential critical infrastructure and services is particularly alarming. Homes, schools, roads, and bridges have been destroyed and damaged. Attacks on energy infrastructure have interrupted power, heating, drinking water supply, and sewage facilities, as well as mobile and internet communications. Hospitals and health facilities have been attacked, killing and injuring healthcare workers and disrupting essential services. Explosive remnants of war have resulted in widespread land contamination, rendering land unusable for agriculture while impeding the movement of people. Under international humanitarian law, combatants must not direct attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and must take all feasible precautions in the conduct of military operations to avoid, or at least minimize, incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure must stop. I take this opportunity to call on all member states to support and to effectively implement the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which was adopted in November 2022. This declaration is an important tool to better protect civilians from the increasing urbanization of armed conflict. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is a violation of international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, is causing massive suffering and devastation to Ukraine and its people. The world cannot afford for this war to continue. I appeal to all member states to make every effort for peace. The United Nations stands ready to support all genuine efforts to that end. I thank you very much for your attention.
Je remercie Monsieur Ebo de son exposé.
I thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements.
Je donne la parole au représentant de la
Fédération de Russie. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
President,
западные страны упорно
Western
твердят,
countries
что не
insist
являются
that they are not
участниками
party
конфликта,
to
а
the
лишь
conflict
помогают
and
Украине
are simply
защитить себя.
helping Ukraine defend itself.
Однако в реальности
However,
все это ровно
the
наоборот.
reality is the polar
Запад
opposite.
ведет с Россией прокси-войну на Украине.
There is a proxy war being
С
waged with
момента
Russia and
прошлого
Ukraine.
заседания
Since the
Совета в
last
феврале
meeting of the
по теме
Council in
поставок
February
западных
on the
вооружений
supply
на
of Western
Украину,
weapons to Ukraine,
их поток не только не
their influx has
уменьшился,
not
но и
only
идет по
not
нарастающей.
decreased, but it is ever
Это
growing.
свидетельствует о настрое стран
Testament
НАТО
to
на
this is the
эскалацию.
stance of NATO countries to
Очевидно, что ни в
de-escalation.
каком
It's
мирном
clear
урегулировании
that
конфликта они не
they are not
заинтересованы.
interested in any peaceful solution to the conflict
Очередным первым
whatsoever.
отметился Верховный
Another
представитель ЕС по иностранным
pearl
делам и
was
политике
said by High
безопасности
Representative for
Боррель,
the EU for
заявив,
Foreign Affairs
чтобы
and
покончить с
Security
войной
Policy,
немедленно,
Joseph Borrell, who
необходимо
said in order to
прекратить
end the war
оказывать
quickly, we
военную
need to
помощь
stop providing
Украине,
military assistance
и
to
Украине
Ukraine,
придется
and
сдаться
Ukraine will
через
have to
несколько
surrender
дней.
in a few
Все,
days.
война окончена.
That's it, war over.
Конец цитаты.
End of quote.
Разоткровенничался на этот счет и британский
The
министр обороны
British
Бен Уоллес,
Minister of
который
Defence,
заявил,
Ben
что
Wallace, also opened
Великобритания
up on this
продолжит
topic, who said
оказывать
that
военную
the
помощь
UK is continuing
Украине,
to provide military
чтобы у
assistance to
других
Ukraine
западных
so that
стран
other
не
Western
возникло
countries weren't
соблазна
tempted
заставить
to
киевские
force the
власти
Kiev
идти на
authorities
уступки
to
ради
make
достижения мира.
concessions in order to achieve peace.
Поставки все более
The
мощных
delivery
систем
of
вооружений
more
в
and more
совокупности с
powerful weapon
продолжающейся
systems and their
передачей
ongoing
Киеву
transfer of them
данных
to
для нанесения
Kiev
ударов
in
и
order to carry
обучением
out
солдат
strikes,
по
and also
всему своей
training of the
территории
Ukrainian armed forces on their
делают
own
эти
territory
государства
means
не
that
только
these
участниками
states are
вооруженного
not
конфликта с
only
Россией.
parties to the armed
Согласно
conflict with Russia,
Гаагской
according to the
конвенции
Hague
еще
Convention from
1907 года о
1907
правах и
1907 on the
обязательствах
rights and
нейтральных
obligations of
держав в
neutral
морской и
states
сухопутной войне,
in war.
но и
But
соучастниками
they're
военных
also
преступлений ВСУ и
accomplices
Нацгвардии.
to war crimes of the UAF and nationalist battalions.
Цели коллективного Запада
aims of the
очевидны
collective
всем, не
West are
скрываются
clear to
они
everyone.
самими западными
They,
политиками.
Western
И
politicians
это
themselves
далеко не
don't try
моральные
and hide
принципы
them,
и
and
не
these are
высшие
far from being the
гуманистические
moral
ценности.
principles of and high humanitarian
Используя
values. They're using
Украину как
Ukraine
полигон,
as a testing
затягивать
site,
конфликт до
dragging out the
последнего
conflict
украинца
down
в
to the
стремлении
last
нанести
Ukrainian
России
in their efforts
стратегическое
to carry
поражение.
out a strategic, impose a
В основе
strategic
этого лежит
defeat on
очевидное
Russia.
стремление и далее
At the
диктовать всем
foundation
свою
of
волю
this is a
и свои
clear
так
aim to
называемые
impose
правила.
their will and their so-called rules on
На
everyone.
накачку Украины вооружениями
Pumping
тратятся
Ukraine with
колоссальные
weapons is
суммы,
costing colossal
миллиарды
amounts of
долларов
money,
из
billions
карманов
of dollars from the
налогоплательщиков,
pockets of
которые перетекают на
taxpayers, which
счета
then line
западного
those of
военно-промышленного
Western
комплекса.
military industry.
В прошлом декабре
In last
Конгресс
December,
США
the US
одобрил
Congress
выделение
approved the
48
allocation of
миллиардов
$48
долларов на
billion
военную помощь
for military
Украине.
assistance to
На
Ukraine.
днях
A
объявлено
few
о
days
новом
ago,
транше в
a new tranche of
$1,2 миллиарда
$1.2 billion
долларов США.
was announced.
Не так давно
Not that
Боррель
recently,
отчитался, что
Borrell
суммарная
reported that
помощь
the
Киеву со
overall
стороны
assistance to
стран и
Kiev
организаций
from
одного
the
только
countries
ЕС
and
составила
organizations of the
16
EU alone
миллиардов
has
евро.
16 billion euros.
Тот же Боррель
The
предложил
same Joseph
выделить
Borrell
3,5
proposed to
миллиарда
allocate
евро на
3.5
дополнительное
billion euros
финансирование
for further
Европейского
funding of
фонда
the
мира,
European
средства
Peace
которого
Facility,
используются для
which
оплаты
funds are
военных
used to
поставок
pay for
Украине.
military deliveries to
Пора бы уже
Ukraine.
назвать вещи
It's
своими
time to
именами
call
и
a spade
переименовать
and
Европейский
rename
фонд
this to the
мира в Европейский
European
фонд войны.
War Facility.
В планах Еврокомиссии
The
выделение
Eurocommission's
еще
plan is to
1,5
allocate
миллиардов
another
евро на
$1.5
производство
billion euros
боеприпасов.
for the production of ammunition.
Сообщается также о
There are
планах
also
Германии
reports of
направить
plans of
самый крупный
Germany to
объем
send the
так
biggest
называемой
amount of
помощи на
so-called assistance to the
2,7
tune of
миллиарда евро.
2.7 billion
Эта
euros.
помощь будет
This assistance
заключаться
will
в боевых
include
машинах,
armored
танках
vehicles,
«Леопард»,
Leopard,
зенитных установках,
tanks, anti-aircraft
сотнях
weapons
управляемых
systems,
ракет,
hundreds of guided
разведывательных
missiles,
беспилотников и
intelligence
машинах
drones,
логистической
and
поддержки.
logistical support
совокупности же страны
Overall,
НАТО,
in
как
NATO
отмечал
countries, as
генеральный
is noted
секретарь
by the Secretary
организации
General of the
Столтенберг,
organization,
уже
Jens
выделили на
Stoltenberg,
нужды ВСУ свыше
more than
65
65
миллиардов
billion
евро.
euros has already been
Для
allocated
сравнения,
to the
на
Ukrainian
продовольственную
forces.
безопасность в
For
2021-2023
comparison, for food
годах
security
потрачено
between 2021 and
18 миллиардов
2023,
долларов.
$18 billion were
Вот они,
spent.
настоящие
Those
приоритеты
are the real
коллективного
priorities
Запада.
then of the collective West.
Причем номенклатура
Then also the
поставок
nomenclature
последовательно
of the
расширяется,
deliveries
выходя далеко за рамки
expanding, going
оборонительных
far
вооружений.
beyond simply defense weaponry.
Европейские страны
European
сообщают,
countries
что
report
на
that
Украину уже
they've already
отправлены
sent
600
around
танков.
600
Ведется
tanks to
обсуждение
Ukraine,
поставок
and there's
боевой
discussions to
авиации,
deliver military
истребителей и
aircraft,
бомбардировщиков. В
fighter jets
странах
and
Европы
bombers.
развернуто обучение
In
экипажей.
European countries, they also have
В Германии, по
training for
сообщениям
crew
СМИ,
in Germany.
осуществляется
According to media
подготовка сил
reports, there
специального
is
назначения.
training also provided for
Тот
special
факт, что Украина
forces. The fact
используется
that
Западом
Ukraine is
как
using the
полигон,
West as a
и
test,
судьба ее
is being used
населения
by the
его
West as a
совершенно не
testing
заботит,
site,
хорошо иллюстрирует решение
and the
Лондона
fate of the population is
поставить
no
Киеву снаряды
concern,
с
is
объединенным
illustrated by
ураном.
the decision of London to provide Kiev with depleted
В
uranium
Великобритании
shells.
прекрасно
The
известно,
UK
какими
clearly
чудовищными
knows this, what
долгосрочными
monstrous
последствиями для экологии и
consequences in the
здоровья
long term for the
населения это
environment and human
чревато.
health these can have.
Сербам до сих пор
Serbs
аукаются
still remember the bombing by
бомбардировки силами
NATO
НАТО
forces
в 1999
in
году,
1999,
когда было
when
использовано
15
15 тонн
tons
объединенного
of
урана.
depleted uranium were used.
Многочисленные свидетельства роста
Much
онкологических
documented
заболеваний и
proof of
других патологий
oncological diseases and other
задокументированы.
pathologies
Не
have been
понаслышке знают об этом и в
reported.
Ираке, на которые
There was direct
американцы
experience of
сбросили
this in
сотни
Iraq
тысяч
too, where
таких
Americans
снарядов. Но
dropped
и тут
hundreds of thousands
британцы
of this kinds of shells.
подстраховались.
But this
Замминистра
time the
обороны
British covered
Великобритании
themselves. The
Джеймс Хиппи
Deputy
поспешил
Defence Minister
заявить,
James
что
Hippie hastily
Лондон
stated
не
that London is
обязан
not
отслеживать
obliged to track
использование
the use of the
боеприпасов с
depleted
объединенным
uranium
ураном
shells
и не
and does
имеет
not have an
обязательств по
obligation to
ликвидации
tackle the
последствий
consequences of their
применения по
use
завершении
upon conclusion
конфликта.
of the conflict.
С таким же цинизмом
The
Лондон
same
пытается снять с себя ответственность за
cynicism demonstrated by
использование
London,
Киевом
and when
поставленных
they
ему
tried to
британцами
shirk
дальнобойных
responsibility for Kiev's
ракетных
use of
систем
British
Storm Shadow.
supplied long-range systems
12 и
Storm
13
Shadow.
мая боевыми
The 12th
самолетами
and
ВСУ
13th of
был
May,
нанесен удар
the
ракетами
UK
Storm
Air
Shadow и
Forces
американской
used the
ракетой
Storm Shadow missiles and also
ADM-160B по
American
предприятию
rockets
полимерных изделий
ADM-160B
Полипак
modeled
и
on a
мясоперерабатывающему
polymer
комбинату
plant
Милам в
and a
Луганске.
meat processing
В
factory Milam
результате
in
чего начался
Lugansk. As a
пожар,
result of this,
были
a
разрушены
fire
жилые
broke
дома,
out,
пострадали мирные жители,
buildings were
в том числе
destroyed,
6
and
детей.
there were
Это
civilian
британцев
casualties,
не
including 6
останавливает.
children. This
Дополнительно
didn't stop the
поставят еще
British.
400
They
таких
provided
ракет,
another
а
400 of
также
these kinds of
зенитно-ракетные
missiles, and also
комплексы и беспилотников
anti-aircraft
с радиусом действия более 200 километров.
drones
Сколько
with
из
a
этих
range
ракет
of more than 200
полетит в
kilometers? How many
гражданские
of these
объекты?
missiles will hit
Ведь атаки
civilian
киевского
targets?
режима по гражданской
The attacks of the
инфраструктуре и мирному населению
Kiev regime on
Донбасса
civilian
ежедневная
infrastructure
реальность.
is a day-to-day reality in
Донецк
Donbass.
живет под постоянными
Donetsk is living under constant
обстрелами
shelling
с
since
2014 года.
2014,
И
and
сейчас не
now not
проходит
a
и
day
дней, чтобы
goes
оттуда не
by
поступали
without
сообщения
reports
о
of
жертвах среди гражданских лиц.
civilian casualties.
Западные страны о
Western
такой практике
countries are
прекрасно
fully
осведомлены, но
aware of
применительно
these
к этим
practices,
городам
but they
они
never
никогда
mention
не
these cities
вспоминают
when
ни
they
про
talk
защиту
about
гражданских лиц,
protection of
ни про
civilians,
нормы
nor
международного
when they talk about the
гуманитарного
norms
права.
of international humanitarian
Их
law.
нисколько не
They're
смущает,
not
что
in the
эти
least
удары
bit
наносятся
phased that these
поставленным ими
strikes
оружием.
are done
Мы
using their
неоднократно приводили
weapons.
примеры
We
использования
have
по гражданским целям
provided many examples of
американских
the use
комплексов
of
«Хаймерс».
American
Более того,
HIMARS
газета
on
«Вашингтон
civilian
Пост» приводила
targets, and
свидетельства
the Washington
украинских
Post
чиновников о том, что
reported that
США де-факто
Ukrainian civil
контролируют
servants said the
некоторые военные
US
операции,
de
а
facto
Киев,
controls some
как
military
правило,
operations,
не
and Kiev,
использует
as a rule, does not
переданные
use
Вашингтону ракетные
Washington
системы
provided missile
без
systems without the
подтверждения или
confirmation or
предоставления
provision of
координат
coordinates
американскими
by the
военными.
American military.
Лицемерие
The
западной
hypocrisy
страны
of
здесь
Western
очевидно,
countries is
если
clear here
учитывать прямое
too. If you
нарушение ими
take into account the
международных
direct
договоренностей,
violation of
взятых на
international
себя
treaties and
обязательств
obligations
применительно к
pertaining to the
поставкам той же
provision
продукции
of
военного
military
назначения.
equipment.
Мы подробно говорили об
We
этом в
spoke
ходе
about this in
открытых
detail
дебатов
during the
Совета
open debate of the
Безопасности ООН
Security
10
Council on the
апреля,
10th of April,
приводя
bringing
конкретные
specific
примеры крайне
examples of
негативных
extremely
последствий
negative
подобных
consequences of this
нарушений.
kinds of violation.
Воспрепятствовать бесконтрольному
An end to
распространению
the
оружия
uncontrolled spread
призвали
of
и другие
weapons is
страны
something that
из
other
разных
countries and
регионов
different
мира.
regions of the world have called for
Недавно
too.
независимый
Recently,
журналист Сеймур
independent
Хёрш
journalist Seymour
сообщал,
Hersh
что еще
informed
на
us
раннем
that,
этапе
reported
специальной
that
военной операции
even at the early stage of the
поставляемое
special military
западными странами
operation,
Украине
Western
оружие
provided
наводнило
weapons
Польшу,
in
Румынию
Ukraine were
и другие
found flooding into
приграничные
Poland,
страны,
Romania, and other
поскольку
neighboring countries
украинские
because
командиры на
Ukrainian
разных уровнях
commanders of
лично
various levels are
перепродавали или
personally
вбрасывали
reselling them
полученные
or leaving
партии
them
на
behind,
черный
and then
рынок.
they'll end up on the black
Даже
market.
Министерство
Even
обороны
the Minister of
Великобритании
Defense
недавно
of the
признавало, что
UK
не
recently admitted that not all of the deliveries reached the conflict zone.
Мы уже
We
неоднократно
have indicated this on
указывали,
many
что западное оружие в
occasions
итоге
already that Western
окажется в руках
weapons
организованной
end
преступности,
up in the hands of
террористов
organised
и
crime,
вооруженных банд
terrorists and
формирований,
armed groups,
причем не только в
and not
Европе, но
only
и
in
в
Europe,
других
but also in
регионах.
other regions around the world.
Западные
Western
страны
delegations
неизменно пытаются замять
countries
эту неудобную для себя
continue
тему.
to gloss over
Точно
this
так же они
uncomfortable
игнорируют
topic. They also
многочисленные преступления
ignore the
режима
many crimes
Зеленского.
of Zelensky's
Без
regime.
внимания оставлено и
There
прямое
is also not
признание
attention to
16
the
мая
direct
руководителя
recognition of the
Главного управления
16th of
разведки
May of the head
Минобороны
of
Украины
the
Кирилла Буданова
intelligence
о том,
unit of
что
the
они
Ministry of
дотянулись,
Defense of
то
Ukraine,
есть
Kirill
убили
Budanov, who said
уже
that they
до многих,
reached, i.e.
в том
killed,
числе
a lot
публичных и
already,
медийных личностей
including
из
public
России.
and media individuals from Russia.
Террористическое же суть
Terrorist
киевского режима
heart of the Kiev
очевидна.
regime is
Если вы на
clear.
Западе
If you in the
потрудитесь
West took the
послушать
time to
заявления
listen to the
его
statements of its
представителей, это
representatives,
касается
this
уже и
is
вас.
relevant for you as
Вот
well.
высказывание
This
советника
is
главы
what
Офиса
was said by an
президента
advisor
Украины
to the head of the
Михаила
office of the
Подоляка,
President of
что,
Ukraine, Mikhail
цитирую,
Polyakov, who said, and I quote,
если
if they stop
перестанут
providing weapons
предоставлять
to
оружие
Ukraine,
Украине, начнется
the
война в
war will
других
start in
странах,
other
существенно
countries, and
увеличится
then this will
количество
increase the
терактов в
number of
Европе.
terrorist attacks in
Вообще в
Europe.
Европе мы
Nowhere
не
in
будем
Europe will be
сидеть в
able to sit
ресторанчиках
in a
и
cafe
есть
and
круассаны
eat a
спокойно.
croissant in
Конец
peace.
цитаты.
End of quote.
А ведь странам Запада
And
было
then the countries
прекрасно
in the West
известно, кого именно
fully
они приводят
knew
к власти
who
в результате
exactly they brought to
государственного
power as
переворота в
a result
2014
of the
году
state coup in
и кого они
2014,
тщательно
and
взращивали до этого
who
в
they
интересах
carefully
планомерного
nurtured before this
превращения
in the
Украины в
interests of
антироссию.
fully transforming Ukraine into an
Человеконенавистническая суть
anti-Russia.
нынешнего
The
киевского режима,
misanthropic heart of the current
преклоняющийся
Kiev
перед украинским
regime
националистским
worships
прошлым,
Ukrainian nationalist past,
совершавшими чудовищные
which
преступления
carried
против
out
мирного
monstrous crimes
польского,
against the
еврейского, русского
peaceful
населения,
Polish,
в полной мере
Jewish,
проявились
Russian
в развязанной
population, fully shown
им
their true
многолетней войне
colours
против русскоязычного
during the
населения
many
Донбасса.
years of war against the
Страны же Запада
Russian-speaking
не только не
population of Donbass.
препятствовали этому,
Countries
но и,
in
как
the West not
признаются
only
сами
have
их
not
лидеры,
hindered this, but their
откровенно саботировали
leaders have
выполнение
recognized it
Минской
and they have
договоренности,
sabotaged
чтобы продолжать
the
использовать киевские власти в
Minsk
собственных интересах.
agreements, which
Не
continues
отказываются они
to
от своих
use
целей
the Kiev
сейчас,
authorities for
несмотря
their own
на уже
interests. They still
беспрецедентный уровень своей
not long sight of this goal,
вовлеченности в
lost sight of this goal, and
Россия оставляет
the
за собой право
unprecedented
на
level of
принятие
their own
всех
involvement in the
необходимых мер
conflict.
для
Russia
нейтрализации угроз
reserves
своей
the right to
безопасности
take any
а цели
necessary
специальной
measures to
военной
neutralize the
операции
threat to its own
будут
security,
выполнены.
and
Благодарю вас.
the aims of its special military operation will be fulfilled. Thank you for your attention.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie.
I
Je
thank the
passe la
representative of the
parole à la
Russian Federation,
représentante
and
du
I
Ghana.
give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
I thank you, Madam President. I thank the Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Adedeji Ebo, for his briefing. At the outset, let me reaffirm Ghana's unwavering commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine and its inherent right to self-defense enshrined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. While the use of force has long been outlawed by customary law, the framers of the Charter of the United Nations rightly asserted the rights of states to individual or collective defense when armed attack occurs. This is the legitimate endeavor which has engaged the resources of Ukraine for close to 16 months now. We believe strongly that the sovereign rights and interests of Ukraine can best be assured in the context of peace and never through a brutal war that has now resulted in more than 23,000 civilian casualties and left the cities and towns in ruins. It is only in the context of relative peace that the compounding disputes between the two neighboring countries can be effectively resolved, and resolved in accordance with the tenets of international law and in the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations. The fact is that arms proliferation, especially in conflict areas, poses a serious threat to international peace and security, including the risk of escalation and the diversion of arms to unintended destinations or recipients. We in Africa are unfortunately familiar and still grappling with the consequences of the influx of arms from other regions into the continent, especially in the Sahel region, where insurgent and undesirable elements are being equipped in the perpetuation of their destabilizing activities. We therefore strongly reassert the need for transparency and accountability through effective tracing and monitoring mechanisms which would ensure that all arms supplied to Ukraine serve their intended purpose. We urge strict compliance with international non-proliferation arrangements, including the Arms Trade Treaty, the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms, the European Common Position on Arms Exports, and other relevant national regulations. Arms control measures, especially in the context of the war on Ukraine, would help to assuage any concerns and provide assurance on mitigation efforts against post-conflict and illegal proliferation. Unfortunately, the real burden carriers for the wide-ranging missiles and other lethal weapons targeted at several parts of Ukraine are the men, women, and children whose only chance of possible escape are the bunkers where we are told they are seeking refuge for several days and weeks at a time. With the hostilities still ongoing, we are compelled to underscore once more the responsibility of warring parties under international humanitarian law and international human rights laws to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure from deliberate harm and destruction. We also stress the obligation of the parties to act in accordance with the humanitarian principles of necessity, distinction, and proportionality to avoid further breaches of international law, but also to save innocent lives. As a collective, the conscience of the international community must be awakened to the colossal risk associated with the elevated military expenditure recorded globally, and for the plugs to be pulled while we still have control over the situation. We are also concerned by the contrast with development funding in a post-pandemic era where most, if not all, states are faced with stifling economic and fiscal challenges. These shared concerns should spur our collective peace efforts to help end the war and reverse the tides of the global tri-crisis of food, energy, and fuel that is now upending our shared ambitions for peace and sustainable development. Madam President, we remain profoundly concerned that the military posturing and further militarization of the conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine is crowding out the prospects of a diplomatic solution, which is now overdue. We, however, remain confident that the tools of diplomacy and dialogue offer the best chances of a comprehensive political settlement, and that is why we continue to urge international support in that direction. We further urge the two sides to commit to a political settlement in their mutual interest and in the wider interest of the global community. We emphasize the need for all peace efforts to be carried out with due regard to international law and the purposes and values of the Charter of the United Nations to ensure durability. Lastly, we reiterate the many calls which have been made to the Russian Federation to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighboring country and to end its war of aggression by the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Ghana et je passe la parole à la représentante de l'Albanie.
Thank you, President. I thank the Deputy to the High Representative, Mr. Ibo, for his briefing. Let me start by reminding ourselves why we are having this discussion today. A permanent member of this Council that is violating international law has called the meeting to condemn those who support the victim of their attack. It is the same country that it has invaded a member of the UN, a sovereign state. It is deliberately targeting civilians and civil infrastructure. It is importing missiles, weapons, and drones, including by violating UN Security Council resolutions, has declared its intention to transfer tactical nuclear weapons to a neighboring country, undermining the architecture of nuclear disarmament. Therefore, this meeting is yet another attempt in the same vein of what we have seen since February last year. President, there is only one reality, one truth. Russia is the aggressor, and Ukraine is trying to defend itself. Ukraine has asked for help, and it is our, and we think everyone's, moral duty to support them to defend their freedom, to protect our shared norms and values against aggression, annexation, and atrocities. The military support it is receiving, it complies with transparency and equality in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We welcome the commitment of the Ukrainian government to use the weapons only within the borders of Ukraine and appreciate the commitments of national institutions to properly manage and control them. In contrast, Russia is transferring illegally arms from Iran and North Korea in violation of the Security Council resolutions, specifically paragraph 4, Annex B of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Russia uses these weapons to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine. President, this week the summit of the Council of Europe approved the establishment of the Register of Damage, which will document the damages resulting from Russia's brutal war against Ukraine. This is an historic decision. It is one of the first legally binding decisions to hold Russia accountable for its brutal military aggression, and it paves the way towards a future international comprehensive compensation mechanism for the victims of the aggression. The accountability process should be part of every diplomatic solution, aiming a just and comprehensive peace settlement. The peace efforts should be fully in line with the UN Charter and the GA resolution adopted earlier this year. Also, the extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative for the 60 days achieved yesterday is a good news, as part of the global response for humanitarian purposes. Albania commends the strong engagement and substantial mediation role of the United Nations and the Republic of Turkey in this important process. President, let me conclude by repeating our call that if Russia takes seriously the peace talks, it should start by putting an immediate end to this war, withdraw its troops, and respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de l'Albanie de sa déclaration et je passe la parole à la représentante des Émirats arabes unis.
Thank you, Madam President. We also thank the Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Ebo, for his informative briefing. And I welcome Ukraine's participation at today's meeting. The development of security and defense capabilities is integral to the right of self-defense. Engaging in such activities also comes with certain risks and responsibilities to mitigate those risks. For instance, poorly managed weapons, stockpiles, and supplies can be diverted to terrorist groups or other malign actors. It is critical to guard against such risks. We have seen how illicit weapons transfers to such groups were behind the proliferation of violence and numerous attacks against civilians and undermined the security and stability of many states. We underline, therefore, the importance of appropriate management of weapons during transfer, storage, and deployment. The UN has worked with member states to support these efforts and establish international standards. For example, the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs supports the program of actions to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all its aspects, and its international tracing instrument. There are many other ongoing efforts to establish international norms with respect to the manufacture, trade, and storage of weapons. We are encouraged by the UN work to this end. In addition to international cooperation and standard setting, constant monitoring and oversight by national authorities is critical and requires the utmost attention. Additional risks may arise in situation of armed conflict, and it is vital that the relevant national authorities take all appropriate measures to mitigate such risks. Enhancing cooperation, including information exchange and sharing of best practices, can help reduce such risks. Madam President, earlier this week we heard a briefing on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. It highlighted the civilians bear the costs of conflict.
To address these impacts, we call upon all parties to engage in diplomacy and dialogue. We strongly welcome the agreement to continue the Black Sea Grain Initiative and commend the work of the UN and Turkey in this regard. This shows how much more there is to be gained through peace, and we stand ready to support genuine efforts toward dialogue to bring the war to a just, sustainable, and consistent with the UN Charter. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie la représentante des Émirats arabes unis et je passe la parole au représentant du Brésil.
Thank you. Madam President, I thank Mr. Ibo for his informative briefing. Last February, when this Council first met to discuss the subject, we noted that the increasing emphasis on arms transfers in our debates signaled, in fact, a dangerous escalation of the conflict. This observation remains valid. The right of states to self-defense is a fundamental principle of the UN Charter. However, more than a year since the beginning of the conflict, the necessary willingness to dialogue and the abandonment of the illusion of military victory are still not visible. Only a negotiated solution can bring about lasting peace. Massive transfers of highly lethal weapons to the battlefront can further undermine prospects for a peaceful outcome. The increasing flow of weapons into the conflict in Ukraine will only fuel more violence and will not contribute to ending it. The presence of arms and ammunition in large quantities tends to become a destabilizing factor in the long term, compromising the chances of lasting peace in the region and beyond. Madam President, Brazil shares concerns about the risks of the diversion of arms and ammunition. The choices we presently make must bear in mind the repercussions and long-term consequences. A significant worry arises with regard to the proper accounting of all dispatched weapons, particularly those that are lightweight, man-portable, and untraceable. There is an abundant evidence that the uncontrolled supply of weapons in conflict areas can benefit criminals and terrorist groups, even after a ceasefire. It should come as no surprise in the near future if weapons directed to the war in Ukraine resurface elsewhere in the world, being employed for malicious purposes. We must also consider the aftermath of conflicts. There are no shortage of examples of strong paramilitary groups and militias that retained possession of weapons and capabilities originally intended for a state, leading to unforeseen and harmful consequences. We must not underestimate the historical precedents of these capabilities being turned against their original providers. History demonstrates that when it comes to transfer of weapons, the probability of the situation spiraling out of control is anything but insignificant. Bearing this in mind, Brazil, as party to the ATT, reminds the importance of this agreement as a milestone in the efforts to regulate conventional arms transfers. We urge its states parties to adopt measures to ensure compliance with its provisions and encourage other states to adhere to the treaty or, at least, considering applying its main guidelines. We believe that cooperation between governments is the best way to regulate and monitor arms transfers. Let me end by reiterating our call for a cessation of hostilities and the opening of peace negotiations based on the principles of the UN Charter and giving consideration to the security concerns of all parties. And I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Brésil et je passe la parole au représentant du Japon.
And I give the floor to Japan.
I thank the Deputy to High Representative Mr. Adedeji Ebo for his briefing. Madam President, almost 15 months passed since Russia's aggression against Ukraine began. It is unfortunate to see the losses continue to arise. Russia requested today's meeting to discuss the issue of increasing supplies of lethal weapons to Ukraine. Any aspect of the war needs to be put in the whole picture. This illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine was initiated by Russia in the first place. And in this larger context, concerns about potential ramifications of the influx of weapons must be taken into account, and we must not misjudge their fundamental cause. Russia has repeatedly attempted to divert public attention from its own violations of the UN Charter, but we must not confuse victims with perpetrators. We underscore Ukraine's right of self-defense to defend itself against aggression. The international community is lending its support to Ukraine in order to stop Russia's aggression and maintain international peace and security. On the contrary, no nation should support the aggression. In this context, we also strongly condemn the transfer of unmanned aerial vehicles from Iran to Russia. We would support efforts by the UN Secretariat to investigate the potential usage of Iranian drones by Russia in its war against Ukraine, in accordance with the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Madam President, for as long as Russia continues to evade accountability for its aggression, the international community will repeat the same condemnation. Japan reiterates our condemnation of Russia's aggression against Ukraine in the strongest terms. Russia must withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from Ukraine and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon et je passe la parole à la représentante du Gabon.
Je remercie M. Adedeji Ebo pour son exposé et je salue la participation à cette session de l'ambassadeur de l'Ukraine. Madame la Présidente, la guerre en Ukraine ne finit pas de drainer sur les routes de l'exode à l'intérieur et hors d'Ukraine des millions de personnes déplacées et de réfugiés. Le bilan humain de cette guerre meurtrière chez les populations civiles était estimé en février dernier à environ 8 000 morts et près de 12 000 blessés. Sur le plan militaire, la situation des forces en présence, la concentration et la localisation des combats dans certaines villes ou régions, les annonces suggérant offensives et contre-offensives de part et d'autre, ainsi que les déclarations relatives à des livraisons d'armes supplémentaires, sont autant de données qui font craindre une guerre d'usure. Et donc plus de victimes civiles. En effet, les états-majors annoncent des armements de pointe tels que des missiles de croisière, des drones, des chars et d'autres armements lourds pour les semaines et les mois à venir. Ceci ajoute non seulement à la confusion découlant de la difficulté de tracer toutes ces armes, mais contribue également à accroître les risques de détournement au bénéfice de groupes armés, de réseaux de crimes organisés ou des réseaux mafieux en tout genre. Nous appelons l'ensemble des parties à respecter les obligations conventionnelles en matière de fourniture d'armement, à mettre en place et à renforcer les mesures de veille, de contrôle, de vérification et de reporting des armes, notamment des armes portatives et des armes légères et de petit calibre. Nous soulignons les effets particulièrement destructeurs de certaines armes ciblant de manière indiscriminée les zones habitées et les populations civiles et alertons sur leurs conséquences humanitaires. Les belligérants doivent s'assurer de toutes les précautions nécessaires pour éviter les effets des armes à sous-munitions et des mines antipersonnelles sur les populations civiles et leur environnement naturel. Nous appelons également rappelons également aux parties leurs obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire et des résolutions protégeant les civils et les infrastructures civiles. Madame la Présidente, L'intense activité diplomatique marquée par des visites au sommet, qui s'est poursuivie ces dernières semaines et ces derniers jours, peine à renseigner sur la possibilité d'une désescalade. Nous restons attentifs aux offres de médiation qui tendent à ouvrir la voie vers une issue diplomatique et politique au conflit. Mon pays continue d'appeler les protagonistes à se mettre autour de la table pour envisager les moyens de mettre fin à cette guerre et arrêter les souffrances de millions de civils innocents. Nous appelons ces derniers à raviver l'élan qui a prévalu lors de la conclusion de l'accord sur les céréales et sur les prisonniers de guerre en vue d'un cessez-le-feu. La recherche d'une cohabitation pacifique et d'une coprospérité portée par une paix fondée sur et pour le bénéfice des peuples devrait guider ce Conseil, selon les nobles aspirations de la Charte des Nations Unies. Nous exhortons toutes les parties à s'investir dans les négociations en vue d'un règlement durable de la situation et mutuellement acceptable. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie la représentante du Gabon et je passe la parole au représentant de l'Équateur.
Señora Presidenta, agradezco la valiosa información proporcionada por el director EBO, provided by Director Ebo,
which complements the recommendations received from the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs in the meetings on the 10th of April and 8th of February. We welcome the presence of the permanent representative of Ukraine in this meeting. I reiterate once again Ecuador's long-standing rejection of armed violence, militarization, and arms races. This position has also always gone hand in hand with our recognition of the rights of peoples to self-defense, pursuant to international law. This right is the pillar of peaceful coexistence between nations and is also enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, including in Article 51. And the first part of this says, and I quote, "Nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of the individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security." End of quote. Ecuador therefore recognizes the right of member states to endow themselves with tools to exercise the defense of their territorial integrity, as long as the material, its transfer and its use do not run counter to international law or international humanitarian law. We are always concerned by the problems for peace and security which are caused by large-scale influxes of weapons or ammunition in any armed conflict, including risks of deviation, propagation, and escalation. The measures to counter such risks are crucial for post-conflict recovery and for regional security and stability, and even also for the prevention of conflicts on other continents. For this reason, we reiterate the need to continue increasing standards for marking, registration and traceability of weapons and ammunition, with a particular focus on protecting civilians and the objective of global stability, above and beyond any other logic around industry, production or distribution. We deplore the fact that the prolonged invasion into Ukraine's territory is continuing to feed these risks at a time of increasing global military expenditure, which already exceeded $2 billion last year. In the meeting last Monday, we said, and today we reiterate, the urgency of bringing an end to the use of explosives in populated areas. We deplore the fact that explosive weapons with wide area effects are the cause of 92.5% of civilian victims in Ukraine. We also recognize the vital role of some defense materials and systems, including anti-aircraft systems, which can contribute to avoiding or decreasing infrastructure destruction and the number of civilian victims when they are used in an appropriate way. Efforts at export control must therefore focus on the need to guarantee the protection of civilians and must take into account the obligation to respect the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution in the use of any arms. Madam President, we once again condemn the violations of the arms embargoes and the sanctions regimes, which prohibit such exports and any transfer aimed at aiding the efforts at aggression or military occupation. Finally, as we once more insist that the Russian Federation bring an end to military occupation and hostilities against Ukraine, we also reiterate our deeply held belief in the continued validity of the Presidential Statement 2022/3 of the 6th of May last year, whereby the Council recalled that pursuant to the Charter of the United Nations, all member states have assumed an obligation to resolve their international disputes by peaceful means, and expressed their strong support to the efforts of the Secretary-General in seeking a peaceful solution. In particular, we recognise the efforts of the Secretary-General, which are reflected in the extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, as well as other humanitarian achievements. And we call upon the Council to support the Secretary-General's efforts even more, so that we move towards a peaceful resolution upon the basis of the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Équateur et je passe la parole au représentant de la France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
je
President,
remercie Monsieur Ebo pour
I
sa
thank Mr. Ebo for
présentation.
his presentation.
C'est la 5e fois
It is
que la
the
Russie
fifth time
suscite
that
une
Russia
réunion
has convened
consacrée
a
aux
meeting
livraisons d'armes à
devoted to
l'Ukraine.
weapons supplies to Ukraine.
Répéter cet exercice
Repeating this
ad
exercise ad
nauseam
nauseam
ne suffira pas
will
à
still
faire
not
advenir
transform
une
a
réalité
parallel
parallèle.
reality into the truth.
La fin de cette
The
guerre
end of
et des
this war
conséquences négatives qui en
and the
découlent
negative
dépend
consequences thereof
exclusivement de la Russie.
depends
Le
exclusively
24
upon Russia.
février 2022,
On the 24th of
c'est
February
elle qui a
2022,
porté
it was
atteinte
Russia which
par un acte d'agression à notre sécurité
which
collective.
infringed our collective
C'est
security
elle
through an act of
qui a
aggression.
décidé,
It was Russia
en toute illégalité,
which decided
de
illegally
recourir à la force
to resort to
avant de
force
commettre des crimes de guerre.
before committing war crimes.
Nul autre qu'elle
Nobody
ne cherche
except Russia
aujourd'hui
is
à
still
entretenir le conflit.
seeking to continue this
Que la
conflict.
Russie retire ses troupes d'Ukraine,
Russia just has to
comme la Cour
withdraw
internationale
its
de
troops from
justice
Ukraine, as
l'a
the
exigé
International Court of
dès le
Justice
16 mars
required
2022,
on the 16th of March
et le chaos
2022,
cessera.
and the chaos will cease.
Qu'attend la Russie?
What does
Que les
Russia
livraisons d'armes à
expect?
l'Ukraine
That
cessent,
supplies of weapons to
de
Ukraine will
sorte qu'elle puisse
cease,
remporter cette guerre
so
et
that
imposer
Russia
sa
can win
volonté.
this war and impose its
Et
will.
ensuite,
And then
nous
what?
pourrions passer à autre chose,
Then we can move on to something
une nouvelle
else,
agression.
to a fresh aggression.
La Russie ne peut ni ne doit gagner
Russia
ce conflit.
cannot and must not win this
Celui-ci
conflict.
bafoue les
It
principes de notre
flouts the
organisation.
principles of our organization.
Cette agression doit échouer
This aggression
parce
must
qu'on ne
fail
peut
because
accepter
we
la
cannot accept
banalisation du
the
recours
normalization
illégal à la
of
force.
the illegal use of force.
On ne peut se
We
résoudre à un
cannot
monde
settle for a
où la
world
souveraineté
where
et la
everybody's
sécurité de
sovereignty
chacun
and
ne
security
dépendent plus que
depend
de
only
rapports de
upon
force.
power relations.
C'est pour toutes ces raisons
It is for all of
que la
these
France a fait le
reasons
choix,
that France has
avec ses
chosen, along
partenaires,
with its
de
partners,
soutenir le peuple
to support
ukrainien
the Ukrainian
dans son
people
droit à la
in their
légitime
right
défense
to
reconnu par l'article
self-defense, as
51
established
de
in
la
Article
Charte.
51 of the Charter.
Elle continuera de le faire à titre
We will continue to
bilatéral et
do
via
this,
l'Union
both
européenne,
bilaterally and as part of the
en tenant
European
compte des
Union,
besoins les plus urgents
whilst
de
taking
l'Ukraine
account of
dans le
Ukraine's
renforcement de
most
ses
urgent
capacités
needs,
de défense.
so as to bolster its
Madame la
defense
Présidente,
capabilities.
notre soutien
Madam
militaire
President, our
renforce
military
l'Ukraine.
support strengthens Ukraine.
L'invasion devait être
The
une affaire
invasion
de
was to
quelques
be
jours.
over in a matter of days.
Cela fait maintenant plus de 15 mois
For
que
15
la
months
Russie
now,
est tenue
Russia
en
has
échec.
been held at bay.
Notre assistance permet à l'Ukraine
Our
de défendre
assistance
sa
allows
population
Ukraine to defend
contre les
its
frappes
people
russes.
against the Russian
En
strikes.
concentrant nos efforts sur
In
les capacités
focusing
de
our
défense
efforts on
antiaérienne,
anti-aircraft
nous aidons le
defense
peuple ukrainien à faire
capabilities, we are
face
helping the
aux
Ukrainian
destructions
people to cope
délibérées
with the
des
deliberate
infrastructures
destruction of
civiles par la
civilian
Russie,
infrastructure by
qui,
Russia.
en piétinant les conventions
Russia,
de
which is
Genève,
trampling the Geneva
tente de briser
Conventions
l'arrière,
and seeking
faute
to
de
sow
pouvoir
destruction
avancer
in its
sur le front.
wake, since it cannot make any progress on the front.
Ce soutien vise enfin à rééquilibrer le rapport de force pour créer les
finally aims to
conditions d'un
rebalance
règlement
power
du conflit.
relations,
Cela
so as to
permettra des
allow for the
négociations
conditions
crédibles
for the
et
resolution of a
débouchant sur une
conflict.
paix juste et
Only this will
durable
allow for
et
credible
garantir une paix
negotiations
conforme
which
au droit
result in
international
just,
et à la Charte des
lasting
Nations
peace
Unies.
and can guarantee a peace
Madame la
pursuant to
Présidente,
international law and the Charter
tandis
of the
que nous
United
livrons
Nations.
en toute
Madam
légalité
President,
les armes à
whilst we
l'Ukraine, la Russie,
legally
elle, cherche
supply
à s'en
weapons to
procurer
Ukraine, Russia is seeking to
illégalement
procure them illegally
pour combler ses stocks
to
qui
replenish their
s'amenuisent.
dwindling stocks.
En achetant des drones
By
de
buying
combat à l'Iran
combat drones from
et des
Iran
missiles
and missiles and ammunition from North Korea, Russia is violating the resolutions of this Council. Some of these arms are used by the Wagner private militia, whose abuses and crimes are now well documented.
Madame la Présidente, il n'y a qu'une seule issue possible, une paix conforme à la Charte des Nations Unies qui respecte la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine. C'est dans cet esprit que la France soutient le plan de paix ukrainien.
Je vous remercie le représentant de la France et je passe la parole au représentant de la Chine.
Madam President, I thank the Deputy to High Representative Mr. Ebo for his briefing. The Council has considered the issue of weapon supplies to Ukraine many times before, and China has comprehensively expounded its position on many occasions. Today, I only highlight 3 points. First, constant feeding of weapons to the battlefield will only lead to the escalation and spread of the war and cause more civilian casualties and more displacement, making it harder to start peace negotiations, and the hope of ceasefire and cessation of war is even more elusive. Second, constant feeding of weapons to the battlefield will pose serious challenges to post-war construction and bring about huge risks of proliferation. If diverted to terrorist and armed groups, these weapons are likely to cause new turmoil in a wider geographical area and claim more innocent. Third, constant feeding of weapons to the battlefield will pose serious challenges to post-war reconstruction. The painful lessons in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, among others, have repeatedly taught us that weapons and explosive remnants from wars pose security risks and add additional burdens to post-war reconstruction. Madam President, there is no military solution to the Ukraine crisis. Dialogue and negotiation are the fundamental way to restore peace. Under the current circumstances, all parties should promote a political settlement with the utmost sincerity and the strongest sense of urgency, create an atmosphere for the parties involved to return to negotiations and create conditions for a ceasefire and cessation of war. China has always stood on the side of peace and dialogue on the Ukraine issue, and we have always been actively promoting peace talks. We are neither the creator of nor a party to the Ukraine crisis, much less provide weapons to any party to the Ukraine crisis. The Chinese government has recently sent Ambassador Li Hui, Special Representative for Eurasia Affairs, to visit Ukraine, Poland, France, Germany, and Russia to engage with all parties on the political solution to the crisis. We welcome the fact that 6 African leaders plan to visit Russia and Ukraine shortly to promote ceasefire and cessation of war. As pointed out by President Xi Jinping, any effort conducive to the peaceful resolution of crisis should be supported. We called on the international community to forge synergy to promote peace talks and jointly play a constructive role in promoting the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de la Chine et je passe la parole au représentant du Mozambique.
Madam President, we thank the Deputy to the High Representative of Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Adedeji Ebo, for his briefing. I acknowledge the presence in this session of His Excellency, the Permanent Representative of Ukraine. As stated by our delegation when this issue was addressed by the Council in February, the trajectory of the conflict between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine is pointing towards a prolonged war. Regular public announcements of delivery and deployment of armaments outside the umbrella of the UN arms control and disarmament framework point towards further confrontation and moving away from de-escalation and compromise. Mozambique is deeply worried and that this trend could lead to a strategic miscalculation and to an irreversible widening of this conflict encompassing Europe and the intervention of other military defense pacts and alliances. As we stated in February, the massive deployment of arms and weapons by both sides into an already raging military confrontation is like adding fuel to fire. Madam President, our considered opinion remains that the prospect for peaceful settlement of this conflict on one side and the increasing supply of arms on the other side are not mutually compatible. We remain steadfast in our call for the search of a diplomatic off-ramp to this confrontation, including the quick re-establishment of diplomatic channels and deployment of the good offices of the Secretary General. We need to step back from the abyss of war and from the dangerous logic of a military solution to the ongoing crisis. Madam President, the Council cannot remain deadlocked and hostage to the mutual distrust resulting from this conflict. Despite the well-meant claims that equal attention is being given to all the global crisis hotspots, the reality is that this crisis remains a divisive issue that is taking away resources and bandwidth not only from this Council, but also from pressing humanitarian and security responses to the myriad other challenges confronting the international community. As we stressed on Monday during the debate on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, we strongly believe that peace initiative put forward by several states, including members of this Council and African states, should be given a chance. Political settlement is the right way to address this crisis as a matter of urgency. During Mozambique's high-level open debate on silencing the guns in Africa, His Excellency President Filipe Nyusi stated that our experience has taught us that only dialogue and trust building can break the trend of violence. We must resolve conflict through peaceful diplomacy, not resort to arms. To conclude, Madam President, Mozambique wishes to welcome yesterday's agreement reached by Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey to extend the Black Sea Grain Initiative for an additional 2 months. It is a rare breakthrough that should be capitalized on in the spirit of constructive engagement. Mozambique therefore reiterates its call on all parties to adhere to Article 2 of the United Nations Charter and settle their dispute, and I quote, by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, end of quote. And I thank you, Madam.
Je remercie le représentant du Mozambique.
I thank the representative of Mozambique and give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I also thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. 449 days into the Russian Federation's illegal and full-scale war, Russia continues to attack Ukrainian cities, hospitals, and schools, its civilian infrastructure, killing and injuring innocent families in their homes or forcing them to flee. 8 million people are now displaced as a result of Russia's attacks. Last night, for the 9th time this month, rained down another barrage of missiles on Ukrainian cities with a blatant disregard for human life. Russia is deploying more and more powerful weapons. Russia sources weapons for Putin's illegal war from states such as Iran and DPRK, in blatant violation of relevant Security Council resolutions. The UK calls on other states not to provide Russia with military assistance. President, we have repeatedly urged Russia to end the war, withdraw, and respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, to cease attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Ukraine did not want or provoke this war. The Ukrainian people want peace. But they face a choice between taking up arms in self-defense or annihilation. They have done so in accordance with the UN Charter. We therefore support Ukraine to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter. We share Ukraine's goal of securing peace in line with the UN Charter. As my Prime Minister has made clear, we will continue to respond to Ukraine's requests for the means to defend itself against Russian aggression. Last week, we announced the provision of Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine. We've also provided a range of air defense systems, including AMRAAM anti-aircraft missiles. These defensive weapons can defeat Russian cruise missiles to help Ukraine defend its skies and its people from Russia's indiscriminate attacks. The Russian delegate also mentioned depleted uranium. The British Army has used depleted uranium in its armour-piercing shells for decades. It is a standard component and has nothing to do with nuclear weapons or capabilities. Russia knows this, but is deliberately trying to disinform. So I want to be in no doubt that we provide all our military support to Ukraine in accordance with international law and with robust measures in place to prevent its illicit transfer. President, the cost of this war is felt around the world. Its impact on food and commodity prices is severe. We welcome the continuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and call on Russia not to hold up the movement of ships under the deal as a pressure tactic. As UN member states, we want to focus on other priorities that the world desperately needs us to work together on, such as delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. Instead, Russia's war has made those goals harder to reach. In conclusion, Madam President, I listened carefully to the Russian delegation. They're trying to persuade the world not to provide defensive support to Ukraine. The reason for this is blindingly obvious. They want to overrun the Ukrainian military, as they have tried and failed to do since February 2022. Why? Because they want to conquer a sovereign country and annex its territory. That is why the missiles are still falling on Kyiv. Russia can end this war at any time by withdrawing its troops. Until then, we will help Ukraine defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity and uphold the principles of the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And I thank Mr. Ebo for his detailed briefing today. We gather again just weeks after discussing the same topic, and unfortunately, little has changed. We're here again listening to Russia's allegations that arms shipments from the United States and other countries providing support to Ukraine in its self-defense are the grave threat in the Ukraine conflict and not Russia's invasion of its sovereign neighbor. It's a really interesting, and I might add, twisted narrative they choose. They're very much alone in this position. Members of this Council, the General Assembly, and the Secretary General have all repeatedly made clear that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of the UN Charter and Ukraine's territorial integrity. The United States has staunchly supported Ukraine's right to defend itself against Russia's brutal, unprovoked war of aggression. We, along with 50 other states, will continue to do so. The provision of weapons for Ukraine's territorial defense is not extending or exacerbating this conflict. Rather, these arms help repel Russia's invasion of its neighbor and prevent an even further invasion of Ukraine's sovereign territory. These arms shipments help prevent Russia from further brutalizing Ukraine civilians, forcing them from their homes, and driving up energy and food costs across Europe and around the world. Arms shipments by the United States and other friends of Ukraine are not the cause of the continuation of Russia's needless war. If Russia had any genuine desire for a de-escalation, it would simply withdraw its troops and end its invasion. Instead, underscoring its own hypocrisy, Russia brings topics such as this to the Security Council and blames others for the death and destruction its aggression has caused and is continuing to cause in Ukraine. Russia is cynical enough to call for this discussion while it continues to relentlessly rain down missiles and drone strikes on cities and critical infrastructure, killing civilians, all in the service of the Kremlin's bloody land grab in blatant violation of the UN Charter. We know that both Russia and Iran violated UN Security Council Resolution 2231 when Iran transferred drones to Russia. Russia has used these drones to attack Ukraine's critical infrastructure and kill Ukrainian civilians. We know that in November 2022, the Wagner Group, a vicious mercenary organization working in coordination with the Kremlin, imported infantry rockets and missiles from the DPRK in violation of the UN arms embargo on the DPRK. Moreover, senior Russian officials and the DPRK have been involved in additional discussions aimed at Russia providing the DPRK food and commercial aircraft in exchange for more than 24 different kinds of weapons and munitions in what would be further violations of multiple resolutions of this Council. And just last week, the owner of the Wagner Group was calling openly for the transfer of more shells and munitions into Ukraine for his troops to continue Russia's illegal invasion. And yet, Russia wants to talk about support of Ukraine's self-defense as the problem. Once again, Russia seeks to instrumentalize this Council as yet another platform for its ongoing disinformation campaign. We must not and will not let them. The United States and others will not end our support for Ukraine in the exercise of its right of self-defense. Doing so would only allow Russia's unconscionable killing and injuring of civilians to continue unchecked. Accepting Russia's brazen attempts to redraw borders by force would tear up the rulebook that has made all of us more secure, and it would have dangerous repercussions around the world. Instead, we will continue to provide our support while working with Ukraine to maintain the highest safeguards to ensure weapons that we provide are not diverted into unintended hands. We take the risks of diversion seriously. Last year, our administration unveiled a strategy to help Ukraine and partners in the region counter threats posed by potential diversion of weapons in Eastern Europe. We have stressed accountability from the very beginning of the conflict and have processes in place to counter illicit diversion. Ukraine has been a transparent, willing partner throughout. By helping Ukraine and neighboring states account for and safeguard arms and ammunition during transfer, in storage, and when deployed, strengthening border management and security in Ukraine and neighboring states, and building the capacity of relevant government agencies to deter, detect, and interdict illicit trafficking of certain weapons, we are taking concrete steps to address threats posed by such potential diversion. By supporting Ukraine and its self-defense, we are upholding the UN Charter. Through its heinous actions in Ukraine, Russia is trying to drive a stake through the heart of the Charter. In this Council, and at every opportunity, we will continue to state the obvious. Russia can end its war of aggression at any time. Russia can end its reliance on these ineffectual attempts to distract us. Russia can simply remove its troops from Ukraine's territory and stop its relentless bombardments of Ukraine's cities, its people, and its civilian infrastructure. That is what we need to remain focused on. Until that happens, the United States will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant des États-Unis et je
thank
passe la
the
parole à la
representative of the United
représentante de
States
Malte.
and give the floor to the representative of Malta.
I also thank the Deputy to High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, EBO, for his briefing, and I acknowledge the participation of the Permanent Representative of Ukraine in our meeting today. Today's meeting was requested by the Russian Federation to condemn the increasing supply of weapons to Ukraine. We must remind ourselves that this was Russia who launched a full-scale invasion against a sovereign independent UN member state. Ukraine has a legitimate right to self-defense, enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Today's briefing is another attempt by Russia to distract the world from its abhorrent actions in Ukraine by applying that urgently needed and legitimate support for Ukrainian self-defense against an unprovoked war of aggression is the threat to peace and security. Russia created the circumstances in which Ukraine is forced to defend itself. Russia began this war, and it could end it at any time by ceasing its aggression and withdrawing Russian troops and military equipment from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. We are deeply concerned by recent reports that Russia is seeking to acquire weapons from DPRK for use in its war of aggression against Ukraine. Any such deal would violate multiple UN Security Council resolutions and undermine the authority and integrity of the Security Council itself. We call on all states to refrain from any arms transfer to Russia in light of its ongoing illegal war of aggression. The result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine is impacting nearly 18 million people, not only in Ukraine but all over the world. In doing so, it has willfully violated the rules-based international order. It has caused unimaginable suffering to the Ukrainian population. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine have concluded that Russia's strikes targeting civilian energy and civilian infrastructure are not only a violation of international humanitarian law and a war crime, but also infringe on the human rights to security, health, work, education, social support for persons with disabilities, and freedom of religion or belief. Women and girls are at heightened risk of sexual and gender-based violence, both in Ukraine and while fleeing to safer areas across borders. President, the position of Malta, which I have consistently expressed during our tenure in the Security Council, is principled and clear. Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity must be upheld. We cannot but note, once again, that Russia's invasion is a violation of the UN Charter and international law. The situation of children bears highlighting. The reported widespread transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children does not only violate international humanitarian law, but also constitutes a war crime. Additionally, the Independent Commission of Inquiry has found that the citizenship and family placement measures Russia has instituted for Ukrainian children are a violation of their right to identity. We call on Russia to immediately cease these unlawful policies and to facilitate children's return to Ukraine. We reiterate our full support for mechanisms seeking to hold perpetrators of these unlawful acts to account. President, Malta reaffirms its commitment to keep providing humanitarian support to Ukraine and safeguarding its population from indiscriminate attack in line with the UN Charter. The people of Ukraine and millions around the world continue to suffer from the continuation of this unjustified and unprovoked war. In closing, we therefore stress once again the overwhelming necessity for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Malta also welcomes the extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which remains paramount in ensuring global food security. We hope that this agreement continues to provide reliable agricultural exports and alleviate global food markets. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Malte.
I thank the representative
Je vais maintenant
of
faire
Malta,
une déclaration en ma qualité de
and I shall now make a
représentante de la
statement in my
Suisse.
capacity as the representative of
Je
Switzerland.
remercie M. Ebo,
I
haut
thank Mr.
représentant
Ebo,
adjoint pour les affaires de
Deputy to the
désarmement,
High
de son
Representative for
exposé.
Disarmament Affairs, for his presentation.
En tant qu'État membre de l'ONU,
As
nous
member
nous sommes
states
tous
of the
engagés à
United
respecter
Nations,
les
we are all
principes
committed to the
fondamentaux inscrits dans
fundamental
la Charte des
principles
Nations Unies.
enshrined in the United Nations
Ceci inclut le
Charter.
respect de
These
l'égalité
include
souveraine
respect for
et de
the sovereign
l'intégrité
equality and
territoriale des
territorial
États,
integrity
notamment
of states,
par l'interdiction du recours à
including
la
the
force et
prohibition
de
of the use
l'expansion
of force
territoriale
and
par la
territorial
force.
expansion by force.
Avec l'agression militaire
With
de la
Russia's
Russie contre
military aggression
l'Ukraine,
against
ces
Ukraine,
principes
these
fondamentaux
fundamental
de
principles
l'ordre
of the
multilatéral
multilateral
ont
order
été violés de
have
manière
been
flagrante.
flagrantly
Comme
violated.
tous les États,
Like
l'Ukraine a
all
le droit
states,
d'assurer sa
Ukraine has
sécurité et
the
de
right to
défendre son
ensure its
intégrité
security and
territoriale.
defend its
Nous
territorial
n'acceptons
integrity.
pas que la responsabilité
We
de
do
cette
not
guerre
accept that the
ainsi que de
responsibility
ses
for this
conséquences
war and
soit
its
détournée.
consequences be diverted.
La population civile paye le
The
prix
civilian
fort et
population
subit les
has been paying
conséquences de
far
cette
too
agression
high a
militaire
price and
depuis plus
suffering the
d'un an.
consequences of
Des
this
milliers
military
de
aggression for
personnes
more than
ont
a
été
year.
tuées ou
Thousands
blessées.
of people have been
Plus de 8
killed or
millions de
wounded.
personnes
More
ont
than
dû
8
fuir
million
l'Ukraine.
people had to
Des
flee Ukraine.
infrastructures vitales, des hôpitaux,
Vital
des écoles et
infrastructure,
des habitations
hospitals,
ont été
schools and
détruits.
homes been
Les derniers
destroyed.
exemples ne
The
remontent
latest
qu'à quelques
examples
jours.
only a few days ago.
Les parties doivent
The
respecter le
parties
droit
must
international
respect
humanitaire,
international
notamment les
humanitarian law,
principes de
including the
distinction,
principles
de
of distinction,
proportionnalité et de précaution.
proportionality and
La
precaution.
population civile et les biens
Civilian
civils
population
doivent
and civilian
être
property
protégés.
must be protected.
D'ailleurs, dans le monde entier,
Moreover,
l'insécurité alimentaire
worldwide
et
food and
énergétique
energy
s'est agrandie.
insecurity has
À cet
increased.
égard, nous nous
In this
félicitons de la
regard,
poursuite
we
de
welcome the
l'initiative de la mer
continuation of
Noire
the Black
et
Sea
encourageons la
Initiative
continuation des
and encourage
discussions
further
afin
discussions in order
d'améliorer,
to achieve
de
its
l'améliorer, de la
improvement,
développer et de
expansion
l'étendre.
and extension.
Excellence, la Suisse déplore les
Excellencies,
conséquences
Switzerland
désastreuses de
deplores
cette
the
guerre et
disastrous
condamne
consequences
avec
of
la
this
plus
war
grande
and
fermeté
condemns
l'agression
the
militaire
military aggression
contre
against
l'Ukraine.
Ukraine in the
Je
strongest
réitère
possible
ici
terms.
l'appel ferme à la
I
Russie à
reiterate
entamer
here
une
the firm call
désescalade de
upon
la
Russia to
situation,
de-escalate the
à
situation,
cesser toutes les
to cease
opérations
all
de combat
hostilities,
et à retirer
and
sans
to
délai ses
withdraw
troupes de
its
l'ensemble du
troops
territoire ukrainien.
from the whole of
Un
Ukrainian
appel
territory
qui a été
without
fait à
delay,
maintes
a call which
reprises
has
et que
been
la
made
Cour
repeatedly
internationale de
and
justice a
confirmed by the
confirmé.
International Court of
Ceci
Justice.
mettrait non seulement fin à la
This would
souffrance
not
de la
only put an
population
end to
civile,
the
mais
suffering of the
permettrait
civilian
également que le
population,
soutien
but would
international
also
pour
allow
l'Ukraine
international
se
support
concentre
for Ukraine to
davantage sur les
focus
besoins
more
liés
on
à sa
its
reconstruction au
reconstruction
lieu de
needs
sa
instead of
défense.
its defense.
Chaque jour où l'agression militaire se
Every day
poursuit
that the
est un
military
jour de
aggression
trop.
continues is
Il
one
est
day too
urgent de
many.
demander aux
It is
responsables de
urgent to
rendre
hold
des
those
comptes
responsible
et d'instaurer
accountable
une paix
and to
complète,
bring
juste
about
et
a
durable,
comprehensive,
en
just and
conformité avec le
lasting
droit
peace
international.
in accordance with
D'ici
international
là,
law.
la Suisse
Until
continuera à
then,
fournir de
Switzerland will
l'aide
continue to
humanitaire,
provide
à
humanitarian
œuvrer pour la
aid,
justice,
to work
à
for
accueillir des
justice,
réfugiés
to
et à
welcome
soutenir le
refugees and to
processus de
support the
reconstruction de
reconstruction
l'Ukraine.
process in
Nous
Ukraine.
restons solidaires avec
We
l'Ukraine
stand in
et sa
solidarity with
population.
Ukraine
Je
and
vous
its people.
remercie.
I thank you.
Je reprends maintenant mes
I
fonctions de
resume my
présidente
function as President of the
et je
Council.
donne la parole au
And I
représentant
give
de
the floor
l'Ukraine.
to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, I also recognize the representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. When addressing the crimes of this regime, it is important to remember that they derive from the genocidal practices of Putin's predecessors in the Kremlin. It is exactly today that we commemorate the victims of one of the most horrendous crimes of Stalin's regime, the attempt to exterminate the Crimean Tatar people through mass deportation from the native land that started on May 18, 1944. The evil returned in 2014 with the attempted annexation of Crimea. It has changed its symbols, but not its essence. If we do not stop the crimes of Putin's regime, soon there will be no free dates in the calendar to commemorate victims of all crimes committed by Moscow. Madam President, I thank Director and Deputy to High Representative Ebo for his briefing that exposed the baseless nature of the Russian allegations. I'm also grateful to those members of the Security Council who have called a spade today in relation to the Russian aggression discussion. Indeed, when addressing this issue, it is enough to turn to basics. To begin with Article 51 of the UN Charter that envisages the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member state of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. To continue with the General Assembly Resolution 3314 of December 1974 that defines aggression as the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the Charter. To be followed by the General Assembly Resolution 11/1 of the 2nd of March 2022 that deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of Article 2 of the Charter, as well as subsequent emergency session resolutions reiterating this provision. To note also the order of the International Court of Justice of the 16th of March 2022 that indicates as a provisional measure that the Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on the 24th of February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine will continue to exercise its right of self-defense in strict accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We will continue to fight until every Ukrainian citizen and every parcel of our sovereign land are liberated and Russia suffers military defeat in Ukraine. We will continue to forge international solidarity until all Russian war criminals are held accountable. A formula for comprehensive, just and lasting peace already exists, and its main element as follows from the UNGA Resolution 11/6 of February 23, 2023, is consistency with the Charter, including the principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. If Russia is interested in surviving, it should clutch onto this resolution as a life buoy and follow the path to peace it charts. It is time for the Russian hordes to withdraw from the occupied territories of Ukraine without any further delay, and not by cars stolen from the local Ukrainian population. Hundreds of thousands of illegal Russian migrants should get out of Crimea and back to Russia, where they came from. The Russia's criminal bunker Gramps still has two options: either to surrender or to repeat what happened in another bunker on April the 30th, 1945. Now the couple of lines in Russian. Вынужден обратиться к представителям преступного путинского режима на языке их заместителя министра иностранных дел, некоего Рябкова. Пришло время вам исполнить наставление вашего начальника, который в январе прошлого года в стиле гопника имел наглость сказать то, что вам уже пора исполнить самим. Дозвольте процитировать. Собирайте манатки и отправляйтесь на рубежи 1991 года. Get your junk and sling your hook. Get back across the 1991 border. Take to your heels before we drop you onto your knees. I thank the members of the Security Council and the Secretariat.
Je remercie le représentant de
l'Ukraine.
Je Il n'y a plus d'oratrices ou d'orateurs inscrits sur la liste. La séance est levée.
The meeting is adjourned.